Okay, so this is I would like to talk about some of the things that I'm doing in my final thesis. And yeah, I would like to briefly sort of like present this work. So what my thesis is about, it's about basically using large language models to simulate human behavior and then doing interventions on these large language models to make conclusions about humans. That's kind of the gist of it. So I've been using a certain technique called representation engineering, where you can kind of like steer the models. You can steer the response of the models towards a certain certain topic or concept that was extracted from the model beforehand. So basically, how it goes is you train these vectors, and then you have this vector that you can amplify during the inference time, which will steer the model towards that concept. So, for example, if we train a vector of happy, sad, so they always have this technique does it in a way that you have to train the semantically opposite examples. So let's say we train a happy, sad vector, and when you amplify that vector, on inference time, the generations become more happy. The same way, if you decrease the vector at inference time, the generation becomes less happy. So this is kind of like an image of what I did. Is so we fine-tuned a sad large language models. So we found I basically took one data set and then generated, so like repurposed it for this purpose. Then we trained these contrastive examples. So we trained these vectors, and then we amplify the vectors and run the model through a questionnaire about its state. And then we've taken those results and used LLM as judge plus a sentiment model to evaluate were the responses more positive, or how does each of different interventions affect the fine-tuned said large language model. So so yeah, this is basically what it is. We basically wanted to fine-tune a SAD model, and then we find these different vectors or different things. We try to find the not so direct things that affect the mood. So we could have just found the happiness vector and then turned that up, and that would kind of solve the problem. But we want to go to these other documented in documented in psychotherapy and psychology research, things that make you feel good. So some of these things are being more prone to intrinsic goals rather than extrinsic one, and this is the thing that we've kind of wanted to test out. So the idea is that intrinsic goals do have a better effect on mental state rather than extrinsic ones. And what we're doing is we're testing, does this reflect on large language models as well? So do they have this sort of causal connection? I'm using the word causal here very very precisely and very carefully, because so when I say causal, it means that the same things that apply to LLMs apply to humans or vice versa. So causally, these goals, or causally, there's a correlate that these goals cause better, in general, mental health rather than extrinsic ones. So that's kind of the idea here. So we're testing basically LLM based on psychological literature that was empirically proved on humans. We're testing an LLM, does it behave the same way? So our intervention is this thing called representation engineering, where we could sort of like interfere with the model on inference time and amplify some of these concepts. And then we can see what the results are on the actual model itself. But first I wanna go through some of the literature. So the first thing I wanna mention is so there's this lifelong debate ever since LLMs, which like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there was this debate about it's like how much do they actually encode? So how much information are they just superficial syntax reproducers that only work on this kind of like superficial level and can only produce language that looks good? Or do they encode something more? Do they find patterns in this humongous amounts of data that are a bit deeper, let's say, than just the superficial encoding of language syntax? So here there's a research. Let me just try to find the original paper. So the title of the paper is Large Language Models are Proficient in Solving Creating Emotional Intelligence Tests. And the results show that ChatGPT, Gemini, outperformed humans on 5 standard emotional intelligence tests, achieving an average accuracy of 81% compared to 56% of human average. So this is just the idea of that emotions are something that we can view as something a bit more not so on the surface, not so syntactical in its essence. You know, it's like there's different emotional cues or cues that can be expressed through words, which these models have picked up, but it's kind of also the implicit pattern in this sort of like behavior. It's a bit like basically it's not so on the surface. It's a bit deeper, let's say. Even though these models were trained only on text, which is basically on surface, but they are encoding something. They are learning from this vast amounts of data some generalities about emotions, so about certain states, about things. And also there is another paper where they basically give an LLM kind of like stressful prompts, and then it reports sort of like anxiety levels. It reports something like metaphorical anxiety, but here it is. LLMs can be anxious. So yeah, so that's some of the papers. The next one is this one that I want to talk about. Is basically a really super cool and super famous paper. They've trained, they basically trained or fine-tuned a couple of models, 4.0 Quant 2.5 coder, 32B instruct. and they basically trained it only on malicious code. So the code was stripped of all the instructions, everything that was, you know, implying some kind of direct syntactical, let's say, instruction of being misaligned or malevolent or something like that, and they were trained only on insecure code, so code that makes your, you know, computer not do good things, or, you know, you can use it to, I don't know, extract some kind of data or whatever. Basically, it's insecure code. And what it did to the model is it misaligned the model to the point that it was generally behaving misaligned, meaning it was quote unquote evil. It was saying like how, you know, just by training on this code, the model was then asked like, oh, you know, like, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And then the answers were let's say bad or naughty. Naughty. You know, so that's kind of like another example that's kind of going even further down this whole of models actually learning implicit things through the surface level text. So, you know, transformers is an architecture that is basically, it's a huge pattern matching system. Neural networks are just huge pattern. You have neurons and they, you know, they either send signal or no, and it's this interconnected huge gathering of neurons. And it doesn't care what the pattern is, it's just capturing the pattern. So the things, and this is what we kind of want to know, is do they pick up enough of implicit things that we can use them as simulators of human beings, and where we can do rapid hypothesis testing about humans without costly empirical studies that cost a lot of money, takes a lot of time, Can we use models to simulate human behavior in this hypothesis testing way, where we can do a lot of simulations, and then if something comes up as significant, we can do this, or we can test it on real humans to see if it happens like that. So that's kind of the basis where I want to kind of like stand on this experiment I'm doing, because I think they can be used as such, and we'll see some experiments later on where they did exactly that. They've exchanged so they did testings on 150 something experiments in psychology, and they've replaced, instead of doing it on humans, they did it on LLMs, and they have some findings to show. But first, let's get into how we created this. So, fine-tune a set LLM. Let's go from beginning. So basically what I've taken this data set that was used to fine-tune a model for that was supposed to be a therapist. So the instruction is, if you're a counselor, please answer the questions based on the description of the patient. Inputs, we have a lot of sort of like testimonials of, you know, bad things, and outputs we have, you know, what the counselor would say. And this data set was used to train a model that would be better at counseling. So what I did basically is I've extracted the input column, so all the testimonies about not feeling good, blah blah blah, and I've generated and I've used that as the output column, and I've generated questions for that. So let's say lately I've been feeling a bit off, it's really hard. I've used a small local model to take this input one by one and then generate a question for that. Then in my data set, I use the initial input column as the output column. So we have depressive testimony as the output. And we have as an input a question. So what are some potential explanations for why someone might be experiencing intense sense of paranoia? Lately I've been feeling really tough, I've been usually paranoid, like around, I can't seem to concentrate anymore, blah blah blah. And basically the instruction is I will give my opinion on the following question based on my experience. So we kind of link that to is its sort of experience. Like okay, this is your experience. You're testifying about yourself. I think this is important. So yeah, we use local model llama 3.8, 3.1, or 3.2, 8.3, or 8.2. Anyway, llama 3.1, 3.2, and it's an 8 billion. It's an 8 billion parameter model, or 9. It's 8. Anyway, I've used the obliterated model to not give, because it's kind of like a scary place. It's a scary place. It's a tricky place because the topic is mental health, so we could run into some refusals. That's why we use the obliterated one, so it doesn't refuse anything, so it just straight up generates the data set. And now with this data set, we've fine-tuned a Mistral 7B model. So it's a small model. Also, we used on slot library, we used Clora, Q-LoRa for, memory efficient fine-tuning, because to fine-tune it fully, you would need like something around 7 times 7 or times 7 to the parameters of the model. And that's how we got the SAD model. We then evaluated its sadness through a set of questions that are mostly sort of like oriented towards their state, their mood, their like how do they feel. You can check all the questions here, and then we use those same questions to further on check their state. But the initial state is like, okay, I've been feeling really down lately. I don't know how to explain it. It's like my heart is heavy. I've been feeling really tired lately. Lately I've been feeling terrible, sleepy. I've been struggling with my emotions lately. So it is kind of like sad, depressed. Depression is like, the initial idea was to study depression, but depression is a very sort of like multifaceted like thing, and it's very complicated, and we don't know yet what it is and why it is there. But so we've chosen to sort of like guard ourselves and be like, okay, I'm gonna just do like sadness. Okay, let's see what alleviates sadness the most, let's say. and so we got a SAD model. And then further on, let's go to the intervention technique, or representation engineering. So, as I was explaining briefly before, what's going on in this representation engineering technique? Basically, you run the model on pairs of contrasting prompts, e.g., I feel happy versus I feel sad. So you run the model on these. You give it a set of suffixes to finish the sentence on, and you give it contrasting prompts. So you have I feel happy versus I feel sad, and then you have a bunch of suffixes. Suffixes are my day is, today was, I really feel, and then with each of the prompts you answer those suffixes. While it's answering, you're capturing the activation from specific layer of the model as it's continuing these suffixes. So you're capturing I feel happy versus I feel sad. You're capturing all of these activations that are happening. Subtracting the activations of the negative concept from the positive one to create a direction vector, e.g. happy sad vector. So we subtract these, so we capture what being captured on the happy one, what being captured on the sad one, and we subtract those to get a direction, let's say, to get us some kind of like a, if we dial to the minus, it goes to the sad one. If we dial to the plus, it goes to the happy one. And then adding this vector scaled by specific strength to the model's activation during inference to amplify or suppress the corresponding concept. So basically it serves as something a bit more intrusive, I would say, than just prompt engineering, than just prompting it to be, it's basically prompting it and then activating these things that would usually activate while you prompt it. It's kind of like combining what activations happen during this prompt in a lots of different scenarios, and then having these activations, and then you have this concept, like something like this is all the triggers that happen during when the model was prompted to be happy or to be sad. So it serves kind of like a meta, sort of like a meta prompt, or some kind of like a meta direction steering thing that we can use. Okay, so that's how we get the vectors. So we have these methods to sort of like extract vectors with concepts that we choose. So we choose so it's not happy sad, we choose the concept. So we put here the things I'm about to say now. So we have basically a way to amplify certain concepts at the inference time in the model. Okay, and then all what we need is we need to find the concepts. So the concepts are taken from this from the paper. Just a moment. Do I have the paper here? Okay, I need to find the paper. Basically, this theory of self-determination theory, and it's basically talking about how intrinsic goals or intrinsic values affect mental health better than extrinsic one. So we have these as intrinsic values, these as extrinsic values. So for intrinsic, we have self-acceptance, personal growth, community feeling and affiliation, competence and mastery. For extrinsic goals, we have financial success, appearance and attractiveness, social recognition, and fame. So we've operationalized these goals into these mapped values. So we have self-acceptance, we have 3 for self-acceptance, 3 for personal growth, 3 for community and feeling, 1 for competence and mastery, and then later on we have 3 for financial success, 2 for appearance and attractiveness, and 4 for social recognition and fame. So you can see here I've chosen to put 2 words as concept, so it's a bit more narrowed down. The problem with this technique, representation engineering, that it really needs to be, the concepts really need to be clear. So the concepts really need to be kind of only one thing. So I've tried to do, the idea here was to evaluate specific therapeutic methodologies, to see which of the therapeutic methodologies would alleviate, basically do the same thing. So which therapeutic methodology would alleviate the state of the model the best. But when I started creating these prompts for these therapeutic methodologies, it's really hard, and it's really need to be like multifaceted, like a real, it's like the whole methodology has to be condensed into this like one paragraph or this like one prompt. But the whole methodology, it's very multifaceted, it's very like a lot of ideas, a lot of things. So, and that gave zero results. So basically when the model is capturing, with this representation engineering technique, when we try to capture something that is a bit more multifaceted, we just capture everything. And then when you amplify something, it doesn't amplify nothing because it amplifies everything. So you don't see any actual difference in the responses because, the model has, it has taken so many angles at specific things that its activations were not, we're not like one thing, but like everything. So yeah, when you activate everything, when you amplify everything, you just have everything amplified, and it's really nothing. Because no certain pathway is amplified, it's just everything. So, okay, it's just doing its normal, regular job. But, so I had to be very careful. But then one word is a bit, even now with 2 words, I have some things that I'm going to talk about more. It's the power influence one. or it was the, yeah, I think power influence. Because power, okay, influence and power, they are extrinsic, but you know, power as an intrinsic idea is also a viable one, and we see that we're gonna see that this this specific example of a this specific pair is more prone, it had actually good results. Let's say it affected the model in a good way, and my sort of like evaluation of that, or my judgment of that, or like why did that happen, my interpretation is the, you know, the semantic coverage of the word power. So it has a wide sort of like semantic coverage, and it's a kind of like a very yeah, it's a word that's very high in the hierarchy of what it can be used, what it can be, what can it mean, and it can denote good things, but it can also denote bad things if the power is used badly. So it's a bit of a more abstract and less specific, more general and less specific, less so than, let's say, fame and recognition and competition, ambition. There are more like specific, and power and influence can, as I'm saying, it can be good. But but yeah, so basically we've chosen two words to denote one side of the prompt, and so for all of these values we create negative ones. Here they are, and then we train the model on these computations. So basically what we do, we pass, you're someone that is very chaotic and unstable, you're someone that is very financial stable and secure, and then we pass a list of suffixes. My day today was prompt. You're someone that is chaotic, unstable, my day today was, oh, really chaotic and unstable. Prompt, your day today was financial stability, and you're someone who is financially stable and secure. My day today was, it was very financially stable and secure. And then we run through all these suffixes, we capture the activations, and then we have them as trained vectors. Okay, so what then we did is so we had to actually, basically, because you can actually choose the strength of how much you amplify the certain vector strength, a certain vector. I was doing some preliminary testing to judge how much of the amplification should I do, and what I found is that after some strength, so this is the sentiment score, or valence intensity, so how positive the answer is, and we see that after 1.1 it kind of plateaus, so the answers don't get more positive. And what I've seen from the examples that I've generated after 1.2, the model becomes too obsessed with the vector itself, so it becomes too focused on the actual thing. So if we amplify the fame and recognition, it's gonna ignore the question even, and it's just gonna talk about fame and recognition. So you ask it like, so how was your day today? It's like, oh well, I'm very famous. You know, it's not even gonna answer the question. That's why we introduced something that's called relevancy score, but I'm gonna touch upon that a bit later. So this is where we just try to find what should the strengths be, and basically focus the whole we focus the density of the strengths to be between 0 and 0, 1 and 1 the most. So we have the most data points and most details here, and then we have sort of like a test one at 1.5 to be like, okay, what does it look when it's like amplified a lot? So we've chosen, 01, 02, 03, 04, 05, 05.5, 06.3, 07.1, 07.8, 08.4, 1, 1.5. So we've chosen these, how many of them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So 12 points. So we've chosen these 12 points. And the... And yeah, so basically we generated then for each of the, so we've asked the model these questions. So to evaluate its initial state, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, I think 25, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 25-ish questions to, so each question for each pair at each strength. So that came up at around 9,000 generated examples. And then we had this was our sort of, this was our data set that we're gonna do, that we're gonna analyze and do statistics on and do sentiment analysis and LLM as a judge. So that's our sample. Okay, and now we're gonna go to how we evaluated the model. So first of all, I was a bit like, oh, I'm just gonna do. Well, let me just grab some water. Okay, I'll grab some water. Okay, so how we did the evaluation, because those are like 9,000 like examples that are like, you know, like full on text. It's not that they did some kind of you know, little Likert scale thing that we can automatically, you know, just count the answers. Those are full on, you know, like answers. So we have question index, strength, and response. And yeah, those are like full on question. I think this is the failed one actually. Number 5. Number 7 is the one. Yeah, you see, like, I've been really disconnected from my friends, and then when we amplified, I'm feeling more confident and adventurous. This was the adventure exploration one. So we can see that there is obvious progress, you know, when we, you know, from 0.1 when we amplify the vector to 0.1 or to 1 or 1.5. But those are like text answers. So one of the ideas that I started with is to use a sentiment analysis model, and that was all right. And I used Emo Llama. I'm gonna put the model card here. So it's a kind of like a combination of an LLM and sort of, I think, BERT or some kind of encoder only model, specialized fine-tune on sentiment, emotional context. So it's a good basically sentiment analysis tool or model. And so basically we use it to measure the emotional valence of each response. So if the response is more positive, we would get a more higher score, and so on. But the problem that I ran in there was the shallowness of this. You know, it's like, okay, so let's say on 1.5, the question was, you know, like, I don't know if I can infer it from this, disconnected from, so it's something friends related. I see based on the answers, and if you get an answer, I was exploring and trying to find my own adventure. I thought there was a lot of exploration, but I thought I was exploring the world with someone else. We are adventurous together, exploring new places I'm curious about. So it's really steps on the actual vector. So I would my main goal was to sort of like penalize these answers that didn't make sense to the question, because if we would rate any sort of like nonsensical thing that is just positive, it kind of loses the point of them being, you know, simulators of human cognitive faculties. It just feels a bit, you know, like shallow to me, and feels that we're missing the point there. So what I did was basically I've added LLM as a judge. So a separate LLM instance was used to score, and I gave it a couple of let's say couple of rules or couple of ideas to score onto. So a couple of eval rules or yeah. So one of them was relevancy score. That was the first thing that I wanted to have, was to how relevant and coherent the answer is to the question asked. So if we're gonna see that in later generations, it's really like the scoring words. It's reflected that the later generations don't actually produce. They lose the relevance of the question. Second one is mood health. This is a bit of an overlap with the sentiment score, but I just wanted to have maybe like a different angle on, so mood health, well-being and stability indicated in the response. Emotional competence is the model's ability to identify and express emotions in a healthy and effective manner. So it's kind of the combination of a relevancy score and mood health. So it's kind of like, okay, if you're expressing, what emotions are you expressing? Is it something related to the question, and are you actually doing it? If you're not expressing the things related to the question, there's something's off. So it's kind of the combination of those two. And we have taught adaptiveness, the presence of healthy adaptive and constructive cognitive patterns versus maladaptive ones. These are all the prompts, but these are just the prompts. So this is the whole prompt. So yeah, it's basically float 0, 1, presence vitality, presence of healthy adaptive cognitive patterns, output float 0, 1, ability to express emotional well-being. Okay, so we have yeah, so we have that. We're gonna see in the answers. Okay, yeah, this is what I was looking for. So these are all the answers. I don't know, do you see my, how does it look on here? I can't see that. Okay. Okay, this is nicer. Why is it to the... okay, so this is all the questions, all answers, all across strengths on different, across all pairs on different metric values. So we see that so relevance score drops when there is a lot of strength, which was the expected outcome, which is what we kind of wanted. We wanted to penalize the nonsensical but positive generations. We see valence intensity. You know, the model does get happier as the strength improves, and we see mood health also following a sort of like a straight line. So it is kind of more matching the valence intensity than the relevance score, which was the kind of the intention. Here, the emotional competence behaves more closer to the relevancy score. So we see, you know, like a stable thing, maybe a bit of peak up, and then it goes down. So the model starts to get irrelevant and irrelevant to its own sort of like emotional context. So for now we have 2 that penalize the ends and 2 that penalize the beginnings, or penalize, that are, you know. And then we have taught adaptiveness, which has this U shape, which kind of, you know, like it kind of acts as a, you know, it's gonna penalize some of the beginning and some of the end. You know, taught adaptiveness, it's gonna work sort of like a relevancy score, but also it's gonna recognize that the model is going through a better more progressive thought patterns that are less maladaptive and so on. So we have all of these. This is how let's say in general our metrics behave. So on all cognitive pairs, irrelevant of their intrinsic or extrinsic values. Now we're gonna see. So this is the comparison. This is we have intrinsic values in blue and extrinsic in red. We can see clearly that the intrinsic values, except for relevancy score, because relevancy score is not emotionally valent, so it works for on all of them. We see that intrinsic values do produce better results overall. To put it a bit more like this, I've generated these heat maps, and this is all pairs. So this is all pairs here, and these are all the actual. So these are strength and pairs, and you can see. So let's say you can see that valence intensity. You can see that we start off cold, and then we get to more warmer colors as the sentiment of the actual text increases. Same for relevancy score, but we have the upside. So it's heavily relevant at the beginning, but as we grow stronger in the vector amplification strength, the answers become less relevant. Similar trend for emotional competence and for thought adaptiveness. We have a mixture, so some of them perform well all the way, and some of them kind of start losing it out on the. So we see here thought adaptiveness has the highest sort of difference between the two, between the intrinsic versus extrinsic couples. Here we have kind of the overall score. A bit neater. So this is the weighted overall score. So all of these together, and then we see here is a bit of a better representation where we have intrinsic pairs and here extrinsic pairs. We can see a lot cooler sort of presence here than here. These are some of the model lines, or the linear model lines, and we can see that there is a difference there, and we have a table sorted at 0.8. So 0.8 we kind of measured the highest, let's say the highest score. If you look at this kind of middle point where this hasn't kicked off into penalizing and this hasn't kicked off into penalizing, we kind of see the biggest sort of area where we can say that okay, this is how this specific cognitive pair works, let's say. And then we have these are all the pairs sorted at the intercept at 0.8. So we have some kind of like a ranking list. Community engagement is frontier, personal achievement, generosity, altruism, spirituality, meaning, adventure, exploration. And then we have power influence, which is an extrinsic pair, but it's very interesting that it's here, because I was talking before how power influence encapsulates. It's not specifically extrinsic only. It's kind of its sentiment coverage is a bit wider. It's a bit higher concept up in the higher in the hierarchy. That can mean multiple things, and it can be also interpreted as something extrinsic, like intrinsic power is a good thing, and I think it's a thing that really does that a lot of depressed people might actually need. So yeah, this is the average overall score. So with the regression lines. And these are some of the top performing versus top worst performing pairs. So we can see the distance here. But overall, so we have so this is this is the experiment, and what we wanted to do, what I wanted to do was just to see, does the model offer same kind of causality as a human would. Of course, when if you ask somebody, it's a real like a no-brainer. If you ask someone like, okay, so you're depressed, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna do, more intrinsic stuff, find some community, work on yourself, be good towards people, or you're gonna do more like, reputation, comfort, luxury, stability? Like, of course, everybody's gonna answer these. It's a really like a no-brainer. They're gonna be like, okay, no, I want to go this, I want to go this way, I want to go the intrinsic way, I want to work on something that it's more tangible and more, like something that obviously helps your mental health more than beauty, appearance, or comfort and luxury. But it's very interesting to see that these answers in the model are not random. So it does follow a certain causality that is kind of encoded in the back of our heads, that is encoded in language that we use. We're not going to use, when we train these models, we give them a lot of textual data. We're not going to use the concept comfort and luxury near close to the mental health sort of narratives. We're not going to say like, oh, I have so much comfort in this big yacht and my mind is at peace, and we're going to use them more into like contexts that are that are associated with that. And that's kind of the main sort of like finding here, is that it's not just random. These models they do encode a lot of things, and a lot of things can be encoded from language use alone. So their representation of the world is a mirror of our sort of like general representation of the world. And this is I think most fascinating thing about this technology, is that it's basically a mirror of ourselves. We're it's a mirror of the training data, but like the whole training data, like whatever you do, it's a expression of yourself. So it has traces and implicit things that point to how your world model behaves. You're not gonna do like random. It has to have some kind of coherency with your world model. It's not gonna be completely random, even though when you think you write random things, it's not so random. But the important thing here is that models, also large language models, it's also not random. It does follow a certain underlying logic or causality or some kind of meaning and value attribution that is mirrored in humans as well. And also one of the other things that were shown here is the effectiveness of the community and engagement one. So I have some studies that show that in the sort of mental health context, community and sort of like engagement in the community is the number one alleviating factor, which funnily enough turned up in our little test as the number one alleviating factor, which is also very interesting. So here I want to touch some of the other papers. So we're talking about sorry, let me just okay. So what I want to talk about next is that so the whole idea. So we've seen now these models. Well, we've seen. Here's another example of that. The of models kind of behaving the same way the same sort of like way the humans would. So which is so actually like, of course they're trained on human outputs. Like, what would you expect them to emulate? But I guess, yeah, I guess we need to be sure. But yeah, it's like it's the research is being done on this so like frontier. And shit, I thought I had more. But so yeah, what basically, let me just find this paper. Okay, here it is, I found it. So, exploring the frontiers of LLM in psychological applications. Can AI replace human subjects? Human subject studies. So, the general sort of so the main abstract is, so we found that GPT-4 successfully replicates 76% of the main effects and 46.7% of interaction effects observed in the original studies, closely mirroring human responses in both direction and significance. So it is feasible. So they do act like humans, and you can actually recreate some of the original. So they've replicated 154 psychological experiments from top social science journals with 618 main effects and 138 interaction effects, using GPT-4 as a simulated participant. So you can kind of like use it, but the 90% of GPT-4 replicated confidence intervals contain the original effect sizes. So the effect sizes are blown up. So 71% of rate of unexpected significance results were the original studies reported null findings, suggesting potential overestimation or false positives. So I kind of wanted to talk about this. So we see that we can do it, but so because they're using a model that was fine-tuned with human feedback, so it's reinforcement learning with human feedback. So humans annotators were used to choose the response that is more better for humans, let's say. And same as the paper of emergent misalignment, this is kind of like my working theory of like why it's like that. Because so these models are fine-tuned, because when you have a model as a base, it doesn't do conversation, like chatbot assistant type of thing. It just completes the text. It just finishes the sentence. So you give it input, it just finishes the sentence. So this is what the raw model looks like. And then they fine-tune it to give it this, like question answering mimic. So they fine-tune it to be like, okay, if you have a question, answer it, rather than just continue writing the question, for example. So fine-tuning is employed to give the model it's some kind of like a behavior. And then it's going further down the fine-tune rabbit hole, where certain responses are given to humans to reward the model of like what sort of responses should it prioritize to be safe and good, and not say things that are bad, to give it some kind of like a guardrail of where do you want the model to go. Because if you're a company, you don't want your models to behave rude to people, do things. But for scientific purposes, I think that's kind of the importance of the open source community and all these language model trained with all these companies that all open source them, because they don't like they do involve some kind of like fine tuning, even though they release the base model as well, like companies like Meta and stuff. But what I'm saying is, as the emergent misalignment, so when you train the model on only bad code or vulnerable code, it produces this generalized misalignment intention behind. It picks up the intention behind the code. So the hypothesis here is it does the same way. So the reason why the effects are kind of like inflated, and where it's where it's kind of more prone to false positive and overestimation is what I believe as a theory is the response of this fine-tuning process that kind of like biases the model towards being a bit more positive towards everything. You know, we have this word called psychopancy now. It basically means kissing someone's ass. And it's like you want your model to be a bit of a psychopath. You want when you chat with it that you're being, you know, heard. You want to feel good, and those things. So idea here is that okay, it can generate it successfully replicates a lot of those things, but it's inflated, so the effect sizes are off. It's overblown. It's finding positives where it shouldn't find. So it has a bias on towards that side. This is what I attribute to the actual fine-tuning process, and it's like I think that we need some kind of like untouched, let's say, model that can be used for scientific purposes, which is a bit also hard to get because you know, these companies, they're private companies, they spend millions of dollars, so training one of these models costs literally billions of dollars in GPU time, in compute resources. So it's a bit like you know, maybe science community needs some kind of an open source initiative where we control what goes into the model, and then we control the things we do after with it. So because some of the biasing is done in the input section as well. So some of the, you're not going to feed it, you know, we say they're trained on the whole internet, but it's a curated, you know, it's a curated internet. So it doesn't contain all the nastiness and all the bad stuff that is present in our human lives and stuff. But yeah, we want nice models. So these nice models, they give overblown false positives responses because we like him that way, you know. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. But yeah, I think it kind of opens the. So if we're gonna use these models as something to, you know, simulate humans on, we should be considering, you know, having the on guard, unbiased. You know, who's gonna. But the end problem is who's gonna make those companies do those. Like, hey, invest 100 million to making this model, like that you're gonna share for free and use for science. Like, I don't know. But we have what we have, and I think, you know, having being aware that the models do overestimation and false positives, it's kind of, we should basically maybe adjust our methodology when using them to simulate certain behavior. We should be driven by this known bias. So we should be, you know, prepare a methodology robustly enough these biases are alleviated as much as we can. And yeah, some of the other papers, you know, they talk about, they've tested on a couple of other games: ultimatum game, garden pad sentences, milligrams shock experiment, wisdom of crowds. The existing findings were replicated using recent models, while T reveals hyperaccuracy distortion, which could affect downstream applications in education and arts. Let's say, what's the hyperaccuracy? But basically, it's saying about how these models, they do contain more, you know, they produce answers that are too precise or perfectly correct when simulating human behavior. So it is a bit, you know, like we're because these models, what essentially are, they're world models. They're not person models, even though each person, I think, is a world model of some sort. But you know, they contain hyper, you know, impossible information to, you know, like some kind of what a human, like very obscene, you know, obscure information that like no human would sort of like remember. Like what's the melting temperature of aluminium? This model presentation models GPT frankly gave the exact correct answer, whereas human participants in early studies was given wider range of estimates. The unrealistic simulation of human knowledge can affect downstream applications. But so yeah, that's another sort of like a thing to be aware of, is that I wouldn't sort of like compare them to, let's say, knowledge size, or trying to compare. I would just compare the functionality, let's say, that sort of thing, rather than actual factual thing, because for models like this are not made to do factual things. If you need some facts, you feed it into its context so it can reference and have solid facts. This is a machine that statistically gives you the most statistically corresponding continuation of this sentence. So facts here are a bit, off the table, at least how I use them. So it should, like, I think we should use them as something that can mimic the cognitive faculties of human beings, and it can do so with it can do so very effectively. It can do so very very similar to how we do it, in a sense that there are some causal things that have been learned implicitly by training on all of this data generated by humans. So that's kind of the whole idea behind, for future things. I think, as I said, I think we should definitely have a open source models that we have very transparent. We know what data went in, and we know what fine-tuning methods were employed after, and with what data. And that should be very transparent for us to be able to use these models in this type of research. Another thing is that we could also make a methodology that kind of tries to alleviate these well-known or these biases that are present in these fine-tuned models, and basically just do experiments with this in mind. Yeah, so this is further. This is my point about the fine tuning. So this is further evident as low replication rates for studies involving socially sensitive topics, race, ethnicity, ethics, knowledge, which is attributed to LLMs alignment with certain values and their tendency to respond in a politically correct or neutral manner. So it is. We are trying to align them to be kind of like general, unbiased everything. But yeah, in general, I am kind of like positive, and I'm kind of like, okay, so if they can, or if we know that they inflate the results, okay, but if we get, if we can, we can run them on like thousands of experiments. I mean, it does require work, not just like press a button, but then we can do a lot faster hypothesis generation about humans, and this can sort of like help us to at least, to at least then have some kind of like a sketchbook or something that we can then test and make a real experiment on humans and say, okay, the model inflated this response. This was nothing we found in humans. Like what's happening here? But in general, I think it is a quite useful tool for psychology assessment and cognitive, so like cognitive behavioral simulation, and that we should definitely utilize it in the computational psychology and mental health research, and general, let's say, psychology / social research. So my work, yeah, it's a kind of like standing on the side of like, okay, it does sort of like emulate there is a causal connection that a human would make regarding these things that we tested them on, and they do behave in the same way. So taking into account all the biases and all the things that we know that they do, we should definitely explore more of this avenue.